flew through the second half yesterday. Alright. Always have my soldering pick ready here. I'm going to go ahead and warm this up with my flame real far away. I'm going to let my flux bubble and then settle back down. Okay. Notice I've set up a little scenario here. I've got my one sheet is bigger than my other, which creates a little bit of a problem. Boy, that is just sitting way up there. Get back down. See, this is what happens. Okay, that's better. Once my flux has bubbled and starts to turn a little glassy, I go and I ball up my solder in little balls. The key to being able to do this is to not have flux globbed on the end of your soldering pick, or else you'll never get that little piece to come off, okay? It wants to stick to the flux on the end of your soldering pick. And you do need heat to release that, okay? So I've picked my 3 smallest pieces. I get them generally in the area that I want, and then I adjust. Sometimes when you're heating this up, you get the little piece sort of starts to stray away from your knuckle, so you want to keep making sure they don't stray there. So another reason for using the steel pin is I have a nice little heat sink now for my small knuckles. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and heat up my sheet a little bit here. You guys can ask me. I can talk and solder at the same time, believe it or not. I actually talk to the solder. Ah! I think if you're nice to it, it'll work for you. So I'm just heating up the edge of my sheet right now. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep working my way closer and closer to the knuckles. And I will once again say my disclaimer. This is what works for me, okay? My flux looks real glassy now, so I'm getting close to being able to get these guys to solder. So I don't want to concentrate my heat right on those knuckles, so I'm sort of jumping back and forth here. I am doing this with the thought that I'm using a really tiny little piece of solder. They flowed right in there. I think this one worked. I'm doing it with the thought, if I'm using this teeny tiny little piece of solder, I'm just going to, it's probably a mental thing, I'm just tacking it there. I can always go back and heat this up later. And the reason why I do that is so I'm telling myself, don't use a big piece of solder, because then you really will solder everything all together, and then you just have this thing that looks like this, where it's just a pin soldered to, knuckles soldered to. Okay, so you don't want that. Now I gotta get my pin out before I throw it in the pickle, or else I have a nice little pink color. Okay, which actually I kind of like that color, but an easy way to get rid of, if you for some reason cannot get your pin out of there, but you want to pickle everything, you can just take a little cup with half pickle and half hydrogen peroxide and throw it in with the steel. It'll take any copper plating off that might happen. Okay. Okay. Let me just sort of say, sometimes the flux is holding your pin in there, okay, but you need to pickle it in order to get it out, which might be happening to me right now. And so my thing is going to copper plate in theory. So what I do is I take a little cup of hot pickle, put half pickle, half hydrogen peroxide, okay, throw it in there, and then it'll take the copper plating off. Okay, your piece will not copper plate. What I'm going to do with this, yeah, see, this is what kind of happens. Now, if your pin is stuck in there from flux, which happens a lot, do not try to pull your pin out. You might bend something, and don't force it. So I'm actually going to throw it back in the water and hope that this guy will open. This is what happened yesterday. Happens a lot, though. Okay, good. My pin is moving. That is a good sign. But I still think I have flux caught in there. Looks like it's soldered okay. Oh, there it is. It was flux holding it all in there.
Yesterday in our workshop with Phil, he said you could use vinegar instead of sparax.
He said what?
That you could use vinegar instead of sparax.
Oh, really?
He said it's slower, but it works.
Oh.
When you're cold,
So just vinegar and hydrogen peroxide, or just vinegar?
It is an acid. It's
Lemon juice also.
I'm telling you, the half pickle, half hydrogen peroxide, it works instantly, though. I mean, it really, you throw it in and, 3 seconds later it's gone, so.
when you talk about pickle, are you talking about sparax or are you talking about sulfuric acid? Sparax?
Sparax, yeah. Okay, I got that pin coming out.
Students accidentally just mix sparax or pickle pot. You could put a little bit of hydrogen peroxide in there.
You can, and you know what? The one myth about pickle is it's only contaminated while the steel is in there. You cannot, I use steel in my work, okay? I solder steel to silver, and I can still, as long as my steel is not in there, my pickle is not ruined if steel got in there. It's just, if you have a lot of steel and you've got a piece of steel sitting down in the bottom, yes, it will constantly copper plate. I have gotten steel into my pickle, and then yeah, I will throw just a little bit of hydrogen peroxide in there, and it is perfectly fine.
So why don't we just make our pickle with hydrogen peroxide in the first place? Is it?
It's real volatile. I don't think
It dilutes it. Oh, look at this, it worked. I got the pin out, no problem. I'm gonna go ahead and pickle this guy, and I'll pass it around.
Could you just hold it up?
I can hold it up. Yeah. See, look, I love when I can just pull it apart and they're both sides. So let me go ahead and pickle this guy so you can see what's going on here. What I can do, see, I solder steel to silver all the time, so I get steel in my pickle constantly, but sometimes I'm soldering silver only and not steel, and I'll throw that in and it'll be just perfectly fine.
Do you just use regular silver solder?
Mm-hmm.
Is there any trick to this?
Oh, trick to soldering silver to steel? Just that you have to use a little bit more solder than you would if you were just soldering silver to silver. And then I actually have 2 pickle pots. I have one pickle pot that's just pickle and one pickle pot that's half pickle, half hydrogen peroxide. So then I throw my piece in there, let it copper plate, and then throw it in the other one and get the copper plating off. It just works better with just the pickle first to get all the sludge off, and then I just throw it in the other one just to take the copper plating.
How long does the hydrogen peroxide last?
Not long.
I was going to say, I've had to close bottles and it didn't last very long.
Yeah, it does not last that long, and so what I will sometimes have to do if I haven't used my pickle pot with the hydrogen peroxide in it for about a week, I'll have to put more hydrogen peroxide in. Yeah. So, have we talked about all the things that can go wrong with soldering a hinge? I think we touched them all. But you know what? There are so many different scenarios for soldering hinges and different types of hinges that you can use that it is the kind of thing, if you see it done, it seems easier and you think, hey, you know what? I think I can do that. And so now you can design things without thinking, oh, I can't design something with a hinge because I don't think I can do one. So don't be afraid to try it. And well, Ron, you've taken my hinge workshop before. Did you go home with a good hinge?
I have one that works pretty good.
Yeah. I'm sure that's not pickled yet. Now, let me talk about the pin that goes in to make it function. Okay, now I've got the hard part done.
Why did you use 3 separate tubes? I think I don't understand it yet. Instead of one long piece on there. Why did you?
That is a different version that you could do. This happens to be what works better for me. And the reason for that, and what he's talking about, and you'll see if you look in this book, there is a version that people will solder a long tube on and then cut the center knuckle out. The reason why that doesn't work for me is because I have trouble getting that 90-degree angle perfect. And next thing I know, I've filed more than I want, and then my middle knuckle. What you then do is you cut out the middle part, and then you cut another piece of tubing that will take its place. Okay, it's actually more work in some ways, and then I never get that angle right, and so that's why this is what works for me. I just think it's easier. If you're really comfortable with soldering, this works way better.
I ask you like a really basic question.
Go ahead.
Why do you dry it when you have water in the sauce?
You know what happens? I know, that's a good question. What happens to me is more water gets things bubbling more, and so things start moving, and I just like everything to be dry and neat and just have flux that I know has the right amount of flux and not too much water in it.
That's a paper towel has grease in it. You're drying it with a greasy paper towel, and then that's putting...
Actually, at home I have a towel that's just for soldering, and
Okay,
you
good
know,
idea.
and I clean it, so yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's what works for me. Let me go ahead and take this guy out. Clean it up here. So what I would do at this time is check to see if my solder flowed all the way across, and this one it happened to just solder perfectly. If it didn't, okay, here's a couple of scenarios that could happen. This is what happened yesterday is I was doing it, oh, I got a loose knuckle here. Oh well. What happened yesterday is four of my knuckles soldered on and one didn't. Okay? And what I would do, and in fact I have it right here, I don't know what happened to the knuckle, but I've got see what I've got here? My one is missing. I'm sure it's floating around here. What I would do is, if for some reason, one of the problems that you can have when you're soldering is your solder can, if you have your flame up high, your solder goes up onto your knuckle, okay, instead of soldering in the seam. And then in this case here, I had solder that went down onto the sheet. That's easy, I can just clean that up later. If I want to go and do this again, what I would do is I would set it all up the same way that I had it set up. If for some reason my solder flowed up onto my knuckle, I would file that extra solder off before I go and try to solder this again, because then I have too much solder, and you know, then it could solder to its buddies there. And then what I would do is I would set this all up, but what I might do is I don't want anything to solder to any of this. So I might go ahead and draw with my Sharpie all over all of this that I don't want anything to solder to, okay? And then I would set it up, do the flux, have my little knuckle in there with the pin going through, and then just solder it again, but just put an extra piece of solder right at my knuckle that I want to get back on there. Okay. For some reason I took way longer yesterday, so I didn't even have time to fix that. But that's how I would fix something like that.
You wouldn't reinsert the,
Oh yeah, I would
You
put
would?
I would set it up exactly how I had it before. I had the pin in there and everything. Because you know what, if I tried to do it without, that would probably sink a little, or it would move, and it wouldn't be in line with the other pieces. How I would fix something like this, I would actually start over, okay? I would just go ahead and cut more knuckles and start over. If it were a piece, you know, say I were soldering this hinge to a box, I cared about the box. The beauty of having a T-pin is that I could heat this up, and then as it's flowed, I could just pick it up using this end here and just take that off of there, clean up any extra solder, and then just start again. Usually if your solder seeps in and solders to your pin, start over, okay? Because it's just too hard to get the knuckles back off, and you know, it's usually a mess. So I always buy more tubing than I think I'm gonna need. You know, for the fact that I might have to start over again, so I'll get extra tubing.
Marcia?
Yeah.
How do you know what size tubing to get for what type of sheet? I mean, does it just depend what the design is?
Depends on the design, yeah. And you know, somebody asked me yesterday, it's a good question, can you make a square hinge? Yes, you can make a square hinge, but what needs to be round is the hole in the middle, okay? So, and in fact, there's a really kind of cool illustration in this book of using like square stock where you've drilled a hole in the center, and you can use a hinge that's square, the outside of it's square, depending on the scenario. But it's kind of interesting, you can see in there. So yes, you can do a square hinge on something. But you do have to be careful of how much, you know, how far, some of the problems you might come across is how far in do you have your hinge so it's not so far in that it won't open. So there really are a lot of different situations for hinges, and actually I'm going to show you a couple of things of other alternatives to hinge type movement. But let me finish up with the pin first, and I'll go ahead and finish this guy, okay? I happen to get lucky and all my solder flowed all the way along. If it hadn't, I would once again, I would set this all up how I set it up before, and I might go ahead and just heat this up and let my solder flow further across, okay? Pin, another thing, there's dozens of different ways to have a pin in your piece, okay? Well, just so happened that I got tubing that was a little bit smaller, or no, a little bit bigger than 16 gauge wire. Okay, so 16 gauge wire doesn't quite fit in there. It's a little bit bigger. And what I like to do is an easy way. You always want to get wire that's going to fit really tight, just like any other rivet that you're going to do, okay? You'd rather it be too tight and pull it. Basically, we don't have a good vise. I tried this yesterday. It did not work with my wire. But I would get 16 gauge wire, knowing that it was a little bit too big, and I would put the end of it in a vise, and with draw tongs or any kind of pliers that have teeth, just by pulling on this really hard, it'll stretch it, and when I stretch it, it ends up fitting. Okay? What? And work hard. And it comes out nice and straight, and you have the right diameter, okay? The right gauge. So that is a trick. I even, for any wire, if I've had, you know, when you get wire, first of all, wire always comes annealed. I used to try to buy wire that was unannealed. There's no such thing. It always comes annealed. They tell you it's not, but it is. So wire always comes annealed, and then you know you have it laying around in your toolbox or whatever. It gets all bent up or it's got a curve because it always comes in a coil. I always, first thing I do is put it in the vise. So the end of it does get chewed, okay? Put it in the vise, and I'll just, if I want to stretch it and I actually want it to be a smaller size, I'll pull really hard, it'll stretch it. Otherwise, I just pull enough to just straighten my wire out, okay? It's a really easy trick. Now, because I have my wires chewed on either end, because I already did the stretching part, I did it at home, because we usually have the vise is in the other room, but it's bolted to something, so we didn't take it off. I still will cut my wire with my tubing jig. The reason for that is, again, I get that nice perfect angle. Whenever you snip something, it gets all squished and then you have to file it down. Believe me, it is just easier to just saw it off and you already have your 90-degree angle, okay? I'm cutting off the chewed end right now is what I'm doing. Okay. In fact, let me just double check and make sure that this is the wire that goes in here. No, that's not the right piece. Here it is.
Are you using silver wire?
I am, but you know, you can use, that's a good question.
Nickel silver?
You can use nickel silver, you can use steel. Oh, darn. What did I do? Durability, you would rather use nickel silver. Is that my piece? I had the right piece here, I'm sorry. Here it is. That's what happens when you don't clean out your box. Silver will tend to wear faster. This is getting a lot of use, okay? Silver is really soft, it will wear faster. If you have a certain situation where you want to, that's what I wanted. If you have a certain situation where you really don't want the ends to look gray, which is what nickel silver is, it's a very gray color, you can use silver, okay? Just nickel silver works better. I had one of those snips on the end, so I'm filing this flush here. You can use steel. You can use steel. It's harder to make a rivet with steel because steel isn't really going to move for you. But yesterday I had somebody ask, this is kind of a fun trick. You can have a pin that moves freely within your hinge as long as you have something that caps off the end, okay? You can set stones in the end of your hinge, and as long as you have a pin inside there that's not going to be able to come out, you can do that. You don't have to make it a rivet, okay? I saw a box once, it was beautiful. And somebody did set little tube set stones in the end, and so they just had the pin freely inside there, and then these nice little tube set stones on the ends. Very nice.
You can put steel on the inside or shorten it, put silver in the end.
You could do that. That's a good idea. This isn't a great hinge that I made, by the way, because it has a little bit of space in the center there. So what I'm going to do is my pin fits in here really, really tight, okay? And what I'm going to do is with any rivet that I do, it's really funky looking, but it's just a demo, is I will mark a 1/2 millimeter extended on either side, okay? I've been using this as a scribe. It's my soldering pick, but it works. So I'm going to mark right here where I'm going to put an extra 1/2 millimeter, mark it, and I have a little 1/2 millimeter sticking out on the other side. Pull this out. Again, I'm going to line up my little marked area. I know you guys probably can't see this, but line up my slot with my little marked area. The reason why I'm using this thing is because you know what I always do is I always cut it. You know, if I snip it off, I always file too much and then my rivet's really, really short. Or then I think that I'm going to do that and it ends up being really long. So this gives me the perfect length that I'm going to need, okay? I got like silver all over the floor here now. So then, again, I'm going to do what I did with my tubing, and I'm just going to give it a little swipe. Take that little burr off there, okay? Sometimes if I don't get it all the way, I'll have to do an extra swipe. So, this is basically my rivet demo too. I mean, you're learning how to do a rivet too. I do all the same steps. If your knuckles are crooked, you are going to have a heck of a time getting that pin in there, okay? They really do have to line up. Especially if you want your pin to be really tight inside there. If for some reason you're having trouble getting it lined up like I am right now, you can, in fact, ream out the center a little bit, the inside of your hole, with either a little needle file, depending on the inside diameter, or a reaming tool. Just ream that out a little bit. It actually talks about that in the hinge book. It's got everything in there. There it is. Okay. So the beauty of this is it's really nice and tight. All right. So, can you guys see this? I've got my little 1/2 millimeter extended here and extended here. Can you guys see that?
So I got a little bit closer.
There's this and this. Okay. I'm going to take my rivet hammer. So that's really tight in there. It's not moving. You know, my little pin's not slipping out. That's really what I want. Otherwise, it's hard to do a rivet if your rivet can move inside the hole. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is, rivet hammer's got the pointy end and the flat end. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and hammer with the pointy end at an X on the top of my rivet. And what that will do is, I don't want to just mushroom the wire over top. I want to compress that pin inside. So by hammering an X, I'm putting pressure in the center of my wire, so it's compressing it to fill up that hole. Okay? So I'm just going to, and I'm just trying to get my surface, just the other end of my rivet touching. I'll do it this way, you guys can see. I'm sorry. Just the surface of the rivet touching the point here. You have to do some adjusting when you're starting off. I'm going to keep flipping this back and forth until it feels tight in there, okay?
Question, why don't you do the one side rivet from outside the hinge? When you have one side already done, and then fit it in and only do the other side?
Believe it or not, it's because I really don't want to just flare the one end. I really want it to compress inside that tubing, okay? And the only way I can do that is if the whole thing is in there and I'm hammering it from the two sides. But you can have a certain, you know, you don't have to do it as a rivet, your pin. You can do a little threaded thing on the end and screw a decorative element onto the end. You could ball one end, ball it up, and then stick it in and do the other side. You know, you certainly have different, I'm trying to fit a rivet demo into this, is basically what I'm trying to do. So I'm just going to keep doing this, and I'll do my little X. I'll feel how tight it feels in there. That- Still moving a little bit. I also, when I'm doing a rivet, try to remember how many hits I did on one side so it doesn't go in further on one side and not on the other. Okay, so this feels nice and tight in here. What I'm going to do is flip my hammer over and use the flat side. Okay, and that's mostly to just flatten and make the top of my rivet look nice and smooth.
Is
See,
that a flat hammer or a dome? Does that have a dome
It's
on it?
flat.
Can you hold it up
Well,
now?
it's supposed to be flat.
Okay.
It's actually chewed is what it is, but it's supposed to be flat. I still need to do it a little bit. It still has a little bit too much play for me here. I tend to take my time doing stuff. It always comes out better if I take my time. Well, this is the pathetic looking hinge, but it's not too bad. See what I've got here? I've got play in the center. My knuckles separated there a little bit, so the space in the center is a little bit bigger than my tubing. I want to quickly go through some other hinges or other catches. Any questions about the hinge, first of all? You would as soon as you start doing one, but go ahead.
You said sometimes when you're soldering, the solder goes up over the knuckle. Have you tried getting it suspended on the pivot from underneath?
Actually, that's a good question. What I have done is if I'm having trouble with my solder wanting to flow up onto my knuckle, I am a fan of T-pins. So what I will do is just lay down some T-pins flat onto my soldering pad, and I'll set the whole thing up on T-pins so then that traps hot air between the soldering pad and the sheet. Yeah. I'm not a fan of soldering up in the air and trying to solder something from down below. Basically, it takes longer. The metal thing that you're sitting there with is being a huge heat sink, and then if I get it too hot, it takes on the shape of the grate. I hate them. I wanted to talk a little bit about box catch. The key to a box catch, and I'm just going to tell you, usually I teach a workshop with hinges one day and box catch the next, and everybody goes home with one of each, okay? An hour and 45 minutes is a little difficult to get all that in. So the key to a box catch that functions well is the tongue, the part that gets clamped down and put into your space. I mean, you can see this top page for everybody that's got one, or you can look off of somebody else's. The shape of the hole in which the box catch functions is different. You can do like the fat upside down T shape, or a square or a rectangle. Depending on the shape that you use would depend on the shape of your tongue, okay? One key thing for making the tongue is if you are going to be soldering your tongue onto something, which you probably will, what I always do is I will use anywhere. I've used different gauges. I've used, my favorite is probably like a 22 gauge sheet. Silver works for a tongue. not forever. Um, 22 gauge, and what I will do is roll it through a rolling mill just barely. So it ends up being about, 23 or 24 gauge, and it makes it nice and hard and springy, okay? And then I will solder my piece on, whatever I need to solder it on, so the thing becomes somewhat annealed. The trick to getting a tongue of a box catch back to being hardened and springy is burnishing it. Burnishing it works very well. Do you guys know what I mean by burnishing? Okay. Andy Cooperman gave me a trick for if you have a box catch that has lost its spring, what you can do is, and visualize this with me. Here's the tongue of my box catch, okay? You can take one of those little tiny rubber bands that you use like in braces and stuff. You stretch it out, you jam it into the point of your tongue, okay, of your box catch. Stretched out, jam it in, let it go, and then snip off the extra, and then your tongue has spring in it. Okay. So that's a little trick, and there's a lot of people that have a box catch around somewhere that has lost its spring. It really works, because it's like a little rubber thing in there then that all of a sudden gives it spring again. Looking from the side, you just jam your rubber band way back into the point here. When it's stretched, let it go, and then snip off the extra so you end up with like a little rubber band in the end. Okay? I was kind of glad when I heard that one. I was like, ooh, I've got something I need to do that too. So I'm not going to go into huge detail on the box catch because I have 5 minutes left. And but that really the key is to have it's the tongue of the box catch that is the part that's catching. So that is the most important part of the whole clasp, okay? There's a couple handouts in the back, just like little things to think about. Maybe some projects you can create for yourself, some ideas. Couple other little mechanisms, and you're certainly welcome to come up and look at the work that I've brought up here. Hinge type mechanism is really easy to produce in other ways other than like soldering these tiny little knuckles, okay? This happens to be a work in progress right now. And what I have here, and actually I'll show it with this, is a catch that looks like a hinge. There are many, many options. And Charles Newton Brain illustrates a bunch of options for a catch that looks like a hinge. One is, and I'm telling you this is old, a split pin catch, where you literally have a pin that's stuck in there, and you can open this. See, then I had to go a little step further and make this little thing that juts out when it opens. I couldn't just have it function as not have something else move on it. But the pin is held in by friction, okay? And the way I made this split pin was I took a wire, folded it in, and I don't want to put that down on there, folded it in half, and drew it through a draw plate so it would take on the shape of round, a round draw plate. Then you stick it in here. And what I have here is I have a little tiny wire soldered into the top, the end of my tubing. Little tiny wire. It's going to be hard to see. You'll have to come up and look at it. Okay. Little wire soldered in there, which traps this from coming out so you don't lose it. Because believe me, it's just soldered straight
Oh, I see.
in there. And the way I did that is I just took a little saw cut right down through the center of the end of my knuckle there, laid a little wire in there that fit, and then just soldered it in, okay? So that's a good way of having a catch that you have a pin, it's not gonna come out, it's trapped in there. Because the other end of my wire here, let's see if I can open this, is folded. You can see it folded here, okay? There are a lot of really nice ways of doing a pin catch that looks like a hinge. And again, dozens of different ways. I actually, after doing this one, I figured out an easier one that I could have done. But
And Marcia, it's just simply the tight fit tension that keeps that from
yep,
falling out.
it's the fact that you folded the wire and drew it through a draw plate. It then has spring to itself, okay? And then what I've done is, then you solder, once you have that bent and drawn through the draw plate, you got your little wire soldered on there, you put the whole thing in, and then you solder a little decorative element onto the end, okay? It does soften a little bit by soldering that on, but again, burnisher, usually just by use, this thing gets nice spring tension going, okay? So there's a hinge type mechanism. And then let me just show you a couple of different scenarios. This is like a hinge type thing and just a pair of earrings that I've made that is literally just a piece of tubing that's caught. It's just trapped inside. I've created this structure around this piece of tubing. So I work in plastic, if you guys didn't notice. And I've made all of the sides of this, and then the very last piece, I stuck my piece in there, glued on the last side, so it gets trapped in there, okay? So, I mean, just a really simple little mechanism that really gives movement. Earrings are something that not a whole lot of people have found a way to make movement in earrings without it just being a jump ring, okay? So what I have up here is just examples of ways that you can get movement. This is just a shape that I brought. But again, it's just two pieces going through a hole, and so it has like a hinged type mechanism, and you know, you can get movement. So really tubing and a hole, I'm sorry, tubing and a hole work really well for getting movement into work without painstakingly, you know, soldering little elements. This is a pair, this was my first prototype for this, and then the mechanism part of this worked really well. It was the earring part that didn't, so the next generation was a little bit better. But basically this is a ring that has a ball bearing tension fit in there, and then this little screw here is keeping tension on these two sheets, which are then clamping down over top of the ball bearing. Okay, ball bearings are a great mechanism for getting movement if you can figure out how to, you know, trap things into certain shapes. Let's see, can you hand me that guy there? This guy again, the ball bearing is trapped inside these hollow plastic forms, okay? So this guy's not coming out of there, because when I glued the last plate on, I trapped that ball in there, okay? So a really easy way to get movement into work.
And did you solder onto the ball bearing?
I soldered all the metal parts first. Then what I would do is then I have all the sides and the back of this shape all constructed. Then I laid this in here. I laid these two in there and then put the last piece on, glued it on, and then cleaned it up. Question?
Looked like on the previous piece that you drilled a hole through the ball bearing, or is that an illusion?
That's an illusion.
Okay, it's soldered.
No, it's actually, You're talking about this right here? What I've done is, with a burr, I had my ring here, and with a burr, a little round burr, I made like a little cup on the ends of my ring coming around. So when I open that up, stick the ball bearing in, it wants to close. It's just in there by tension.
So the ring has got tension and the other piece has tension.
I think he's trying to ask us, how does that ring attach to the ball bearing? Or is it?
Tension, she said.
It's just tension.
What's the ring made of?
It's aluminum. See, that's why I can't solder anything to it, because it was aluminum. So it's all cold joined. Didn't solder anything on these, actually. So something that I like to do. Here's an example of movement in earrings, really simple. Just see how much movement these have? These are aluminum. And it's literally just holes drilled with a wire going through. It's a hinge type mechanism, but very effective for movement without just having a jump ring hanging there.
And you didn't space those so they rub on into it?
Right. I didn't actually make these, but yeah, she doesn't have any space in between them. So, you know, they really are a nice movement. I've got like a minute.
We're fading.
Here's another example of, instead of using a jump ring, this is a pair of earrings by Mickey Lippy. She, you know, part of the design has a loop. So it's not just this jump ring stuck on it, you know, it's part of the design, the movement, okay? So I just want to get you thinking about stuff like that. And again, this is just wire that bends right up into a little hole sitting there, and then you get, you know, just a nice movement going on in this pair of earrings. Okay. One last thing, my little charm bracelet I made just about 15 years ago while I was in school. These all move because they were wires soldered to tubing that then has a wire riveting through. Okay, so all these elements here are movable because they're just soldered to a tubing. Okay, and again, this guy opens. This one I never let anybody have this because it doesn't function well. So I have all the stuff that didn't work well. Is basically what I have in my collection. I'm assuming that other people have that going on too. Where does this open? Here it is. Basically what this is just a bar going across, and on the other end I've cut a slot that can slip into, and then a little hole drilled at the end of that slot, so it's just pressure. You just, well, yeah, you just do that, right? Just press it on there, and then it locks into where that hole is drilled.
So the slots, just a little bit slightly maybe narrower than the wire.
It's actually the same diameter, I'm sorry. The slot is the same as the wire, okay, same size. But that by having that hole on the end, you just give it some place to stop and rest, okay? So that's just another interesting mechanism, simple, that you can use. You know, and then the hinged part is just all of these things with a hole drilled through. It's practically a square hinge. Holes drilled through, and then just a, you know, little wire going through. In this case, I did a little threaded nut on either end instead of doing a rivet. Okay, so questions?